In a matter of minutes, Jenny was going to come face to face with one of the men who'd killed her father. Her mouth felt dry, and she ran her tongue around her lips. The taxi stopped in front of the office block in Holborn. She paid the cab driver, stepped out onto the pavement, and walked slowly towards the building, smoothing down the skirt of her suit as she went. For the last 2 weeks, this was the moment she'd been longing for, and also the moment she'd been dreading. It was almost impossible to believe that it was only 14 days since her world had turned upside down. She'd been leafing through the weekly educational newspaper that she'd borrowed from the staff room. The final pieces of work done by her pupils at her teacher's training placement really did need marking, but getting a job for September was even more urgent than that. Her heart sank. Once again, the only openings for newly qualified art teachers were miles away in the north of England. That was much too far from Cornwall. Her mother would be alone when she'd gone, and she wanted to be able to come home and see her often, and see her friends too. She took a sip of coffee and turned to the last section of the paper, where vacancies for private tutors were advertised. A few hours a week as a tutor would be better than nothing until she could get a permanent job. Even though she'd worked for 2 years after leaving school to save enough money to study for her art degree, her 3 years at college, plus her year afterwards as a PGCE student, had left her completely broke. She had to earn some money as soon as possible. She sat up sharply, spilling her coffee. Max Castanien was advertising for someone to teach art classes throughout the summer in Italy. This was a name she knew well, a name that she and her mother would never forget. She spread the paper flat on the desk and stared hard at the advertisement. Her heart started to race, and she put her hand to her mouth to steady herself. Then she took a deep breath. She was being silly, letting herself get into a state at the sight of a mere name. There was obviously more than one family in the country with that surname, and there was probably more than one Max Castanien, unusual though the name was. It was highly unlikely that the man advertising was one of the Castanien brothers, Max and Peter, whom she and her mother hated so much. For several moments she sat biting her thumbnail, staring at the advertisement. The only other information, apart from the name and brief job description, was an email address. Could this possibly be the same family, she wondered. She pushed the newspaper aside, pulled her computer towards her and switched it on. It couldn't be that difficult to find out, and she couldn't leave it. She had to know. The Castanien family had a large textiles company, so there were bound to be any number of references to the family and their business on the internet. And if it was the Max Castanien, one of the references might say something that linked him to Italy. If the man who was looking to hire an art teacher did turn out to be one of the brothers responsible for her father's death. She could hardly breathe at the thought. If she could just meet him, she'd have a chance, albeit a slim chance, of finding out why the brothers had acted as they had done. She'd been 12 when her father died, too young for her mother to feel able to talk to her in depth about it, but not too young to know that the Castaniens had brought misery into their lives. As she got older, she'd increasingly wanted to know the reason why. Her mother had answered any question she'd asked over the years, but she'd never been able to tell her why they'd done it. But with an opportunity like this to meet the brothers, and a chance to find out what had happened for herself, Jenny felt a sudden surge of hope at the thought of learning why they had let her father down as badly as they had, and she felt a momentary shock at the strength of her feeling. She hadn't realised quite how desperately she wanted answers to her questions. Several times over the years, she'd thought about writing to them and asking for an explanation, telling them that she needed to know, but she'd always instantly dismissed the idea. There'd be no point. They'd have time to compose something that sounded like a